and that will make sure that we can hear the best from the presenters that we've got today. That looks like we have most people here. There might be a couple of extra people join us along the way, but hopefully that's everybody in the room. So welcome to today's session. My name's Nikki Henderson. I work for the Partners in Care and Health, which is a joint programme between ADAS and the LGA. We're hosting these webinars as part of our work with NHS England. And it's our summer series, so we've got 4 webinars happening. This is the second one in that series. And today we're going to be hearing all about dynamic support registers and care education treatment reviews. And we're going to be hearing about those nationally. We're joined from colleagues that are involved in the policy side of the work. We're going to be hearing about the Cornwall System Partnership and how they're working together to improve outcomes for people. And then we've got a couple of mums that have joined us who are going to be talking about their experience and what made a difference to their families. So if people can keep themselves on mute, and ideally if people can turn their videos off, it just helps to stabilize the connection a little bit. All the presentations are going to be available afterwards on the website, and we'll share slides with you along with information about the other sessions that we've got. If you want to have your email removed from this list, if you can let us know and after the webinar, and we'll make sure that then you don't receive any further information from us. So without further ado, we're going to start with Chloe Haig and Scarlett Millward from NHS England. I'll hand over to you both.
Thank you, Nikki, and thank you for having us here today. So I'm Scarlett Millward. I work in the National Learning Disability and Autism Programme, along with Chloe, who we're doing a bit of a double act on our slides today. So I predominantly work in the Children and Young People's team, but this policy, as you know, is an all-age programme and an all-age focus. And I took kind of a bit more of a leading role in the DSR element, and Chloe's taken more of the role in the CETR. But that's going to change a little bit because we're under big restructure at NHS England, which I'm sure lots of you are aware of, and so and Chloe will be becoming the face of CETR and DSR policy from a national perspective. So from a policy overview perspective, and I'm sure many of you have heard this already, that the policy was very, very well co-produced. We worked with lots and lots and lots of different people, and we also carried out a huge amount of engagement work, receiving over 300 responses from lots of people with lived experience, professionals and stakeholders across the whole system. So not just health colleagues, it was local authority colleagues as well. We also had massive consideration to the wider system changes and challenges, such as the new NHS operating framework, the draft mental health bill, building the right support, and the action plan, and obviously the SEND inspection framework. And if you haven't noticed already, DSRs are included in that new inspection framework. We also took a huge amount of learning to inform the policy from LEADER, Safe and Wellbeing Reviews, and the National Safeguarding Review. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you, Marie. So just a bit of an update on where things are at with the policy. It was published in January and it was agreed for implementation, so the policy to take effect from the 1st of May this year. In addition to the publication of the policy, we have since published refreshed key lines of Chloe is what I was about to say then, because you couldn't have a Chloe without Chloe. So the key lines of inquiry have been refreshed, and we've also updated the code of practice, which has been published on our website as well. In addition to all of this, we have undertaken a national baselining exercise to understand, or to help regions understand, how local systems are implementing, and to help us gauge kind of implementation and where things are up to. So we'll touch on some of the findings of that later today. If I can have the next slide, please. So dynamic support registers, I'm sure most of you are aware that the DSR is the tool used by local areas to identify individual children, young people and adults with a learning disability, autism or both, who are at risk or may become at risk of admission to hospital without access to timely dynamic support in the community. And just to note, registers prior to the DSR CTR policy being published were in certain areas known as slightly different things, such as the dynamic support database or at risk of admission register. Those names may still be in place, but the intention is that they still deliver the same as the DSR CTR policy. Next slide, please. This is a critical part of the DSR CTR policy, is that we've introduced the minimum standards, minimum requirements that we want local areas to achieve. But what we recognise is that that is just the minimum, and systems may require additional bits to be included as well. And what we recognise is that systems absolutely need to work together with their families, with children, young people, to deliver the most appropriate and effective dynamic support register for their local system. Next slide, please. So as part of that co-production and that engagement that we carried out, we were told some of the key priority areas to include in the policy, and that included an increased focus on identifying people at risk of admission to hospital, an increased focus on autistic people, increased visibility and understanding of the DSR across local systems, and increased accountability for integrated care boards. Next slide, please. So yes, as a consequence from getting that intel, we then agreed to include a greater focus on shared ownership across local systems to improve that joint working, making sure that it's responsive to changing needs, presentation and risks, that it's absolutely critical that co-production at a local level is embedded as part of the introduction of the policy, and that we included a greater focus on children and people placed into 52-week residential schools and colleges, and that's in recognition of some of the safeguarding review findings into the Hesley Group and others. Next slide, please. In addition to that, we've introduced some key kind of changes to processes. And that includes having a really clear risk stratification process, an absolute right to self-refer onto the register, that we include people in inpatient mental health settings, and that we have clear links to commissioner oversight visits, and that there is a clear link to referrals from the DSR to key workers, to CTRs, and for support to unpaid carers. Next slide, please. Oh, and I'm handing over to Chloe to talk you through the CTR element.
Brilliant, thanks, Scarlett. So it's really nice to meet you, everyone. My name's Chloe Haig. I'm currently on secondment to the national team, so I've been with the team since the end of last year. I learn something new every day. I've learned new things today, actually, and it's been a real fantastic experience to work with the team on implementation of the policy. So care education and treatment reviews, as like Scarlett said, probably most of you know, care education and treatment review, or a care and treatment review, is about bringing together the right people, those responsible for commissioning and providing services. And it's bringing together people with independent clinical opinions and people with lived experience as well, to look at the care for people with learning disability and or autistic people. So the real aim of a CETR is to check that a person who is either at risk of being admitted or who has already been admitted to hospital is receiving appropriate care that meets their needs, and where possible, supported discharge to continue the care in the community. Next slide, please. So is it all right? Can everyone just make sure that they're on mute? We can just hear a background conversation. Perfect. Oh, I'm still going. Thanks very much. So we went out, like Scarlett said, and talked to people when we were updating the policy. We listened to people, and we included changes. And what people were telling us is that we really needed to have an increased focus on advocacy. an increased focus on physical health. A lot of this information was found through the Safe and Wellbeing reviews, an increased focus on quality of life, and an increased focus on accountability and quality assurance. Next slide, please. So what we included the policy. So we really had a focus on improving the clarity of the escalation process, a greater focus on matching of the panel to the person. This was something that was really strong in feedbacks from families and people with lived experience and people who had had care education and treatment reviews, the need to look at how we match the panel to the person. A greater focus on panel members having an equal voice, and also making sure that we don't duplicate work that's being done in other places. So making sure that we link to other processes that are already in place within commissioners, such as oversight visits and working with key workers and senior and children's interveners. Next slide, please. So some of the key changes to the existing process of the new and updated policy. So within the policy, it's now much clearer on how to request a CETR sooner than the minimum time scales. CETRs and CTRs are to be undertaken for any person moving from one hospital to another. CETRs are to be undertaken within 6 weeks of admission if a community CTR has taken place, and also CETRs to be undertaken prior to any removal of a diagnosis of a learning disability and/or autism. The last one that I've just spoken about, we've had lots of interesting conversations around this. We absolutely know that it does happen, and people do have a diagnosis removed when they are in an inpatient setting. So this step has been put in to really make sure that is being done correctly, and that is being done for that person's benefit, as it's no longer needed, and not to put that person on a different pathway of care because it suits the provider rather than the person. Next slide, please. So we have, within the policy, we have looked at the payment structure for the experts by experience and clinical experts. We've introduced mandatory training for panel members. We hear, although we're working in new ways of operating models now, so we talk about integrated care boards and integrated care systems and CETRs and DSRs really being developed, I guess, to meet that system and the people within that system. But one thing that we do hear quite often is about the inconsistencies within the panels and the way that the CETRs and CTRs are held. So this mandatory training is hopefully going to be up and running by the end of this year. There is now an option for the same panel to undertake follow-up review, and recommendations for a community follow-up are now in place post-discharge. And really importantly, we now have a new oversight process. This came from learning from the Safe and Wellbeing reviews that worked incredibly well, and also to a certain extent link into the work that we've done with senior interveners, which will really make sure that people within the senior leader roles across the integrated care board have oversight of what is happening within their systems, especially for those people who are within out of various settings or who have been in inpatient settings for a long period of time. And that information is now within the code and toolkit that we'll talk about in a little bit. Next slide, please. Okay. So when I joined the national team, this was on our list to do. So the key lines of inquiry, I guess, have been a difficult challenge. We have, much like we did with the new policy, we have gone out and we have engaged with a lot of people, from parents, people with lived experience, people who work in providers and panels, to really look at how we can use the key lines of inquiry templates that are the foundations of care education and treatment reviews differently. So one of the important things that people came back and told us is that the community template really needs to be very different from the inpatient one. And that's because the focus is really to get the right people in place together to talk and to support the person, to really try and look at how this person can be supported in the community rather than being admitted into hospital. So the community template is very different now. More of a focus on physical health. So within the key lines of inquiry, we have different pages within the template, and there is a specific one on physical health and ensuring that that person is well supported within inpatient settings, especially to be able to access the physical health support that they may need, and to ask the panel to consider that person's physical health. There's a really strong focus on quality of life. When we look at things like ICETRs, we learn from these independent reviews again that people were really, unfortunately, often unable to access things like being able to go out into the community, to be able to access things to support their physical health. So we've put this focus on quality of life, and really that person as an individual, to make sure that when the panel come in and speak to that person, it's a really individual thing and they can support that person. So we've taken the sit and see from the Safe and Wellbeing Review. I'm sure maybe within the chat, or we'll certainly hear some people talking, and we do continue quite often to hear about people continuing to have virtual reviews. We absolutely are working with our regional leads at the moment to ensure that when someone has a care, education and treatment review, that the person and their family are involved, and that if this person is an inpatient, that actually the panel go and meet this person and make sure that they're involved in the review. And we are also now working on updating and making our supporting easy read documents more user friendly. Next slide, please. Back to you, Scarlett.
Thank you. And Chloe, there's a couple of questions you might be better placed responding to in the chat than myself, just to flag. So as we've kind of touched on already, we undertook a national baseline exercise to really understand how systems are coping in the implementation, where they're at, the maturity level of DSR CTR processes. That's been really helpful for our regional colleagues to work with local systems to try and support and develop some of the gaps. And the gaps that we're hearing about thematically from a national perspective is that there is a real lack of self-referral processes. Some areas are in the early stages of implementing their self-referral, but it is taking systems a little while to introduce that element. The systems would also like to see some really good examples of oversight panels in terms of reference. So we're in the process of trying to collate some of that from a national perspective to then share. So if colleagues on this call have got examples, please do share. And any of these particular challenges, particularly self-referral. That there's a bit of we need to increase awareness with our primary care colleagues around dynamic support registers and CTR. So Chloe and I have been talking to our primary care colleagues from a national perspective to see what additional communication and publication we can do to support that. That there's been a lack of information sharing across social care education, and that's an all-age challenge. And I think that challenge isn't just for DSR CTRs, that's embedded in lots of other processes. Transition is another hot potato, particularly in this arena. It's going from a children and young people's dynamic support register onto the adult DSR, particularly when they're separate and particularly dependent on where the DSR is held. So for children's services particularly, it's often held with their key worker team, and in adults it's not, and they're generally very different places. That there's often quite a lack of information flowing between the outcome of a CTR and the DSR, and how does that then link into the oversight arrangements and assurance arrangements within an ICS. Additional training for DSRs is also a bit of an ask, so we're looking to include that in the training that's being, the mandatory training that's being developed, and that similarly to some of the other transition issues, that there are lots of registers within single ICSs, so they were previously on a CCG footprint and now they need to be on an ICS footprint or not, and it's how do they bring that together to give the ICS the assurance that it requires as part of the policy. Next slide, please. Back to you, Chloe.
Thanks. Sorry, my computer's on a real go slow today. So like Scarlett said, the information coming back from the baseline exercise was really interesting. And actually one of the bits that was most interesting was the regional lead sent it out across all the systems. The difference across systems was really surprising, I think, especially to someone like me who's relatively new, that actually everybody holds a different amount of registers. And when it came to CETRs, what people were telling us within operational roles is that when they were looking at implementing the policy, their concerns were around panel matching. So we have been working with the CQC, who've got some panel matching already in place. So we're going to be working with choice support to get some information out there to people to really kind of look at how they work better with the panels. There was an uncertainty around escalation process. I think we're doing quite well with this one now. So we have the code and toolkit is up and running, and within the policy, it talks about the oversight group that sits within the ICB. So this is something that we've had discussions with regional leads. We've been out and we've helped support systems to really make sure that process is in place. A lack of quality oversight. I think again this fits into the oversight boards that are now sitting in integrated care systems. So wider engagement across systems around CETRs. Scarlett said we've had this back across about DSRs and CETRs. Scarlett and I are very much aware that we spend a lot of our time preaching to the converted, and actually what we need to do now is do things slightly differently, but I think we'll tell you about that on the next slide. So lack of consistent training. We're working on that at the moment with Health Education England, and most areas the feedback was really mixed, but what it's enabled Scarlett and I to do is really look at how we can start sharing good practice and what areas we need to focus on where people are struggling, which has been absolutely fantastic. We meet some really interesting people and some people who are incredibly passionate about making a difference, so we're really focusing in on that at the moment. Next slide, please. I think it's just next steps. Do you want to do the top one, Scarlett?
Yes, I can do. So we're in the process of currently updating all of our workbooks, consent planners, with the help of our experts by experience. And one of the key areas that we're looking into is developing a bit of a key facts user guide, particularly for young people. So really outlining what do they need to know to make an informed decision about having a CTR or being on a DSR, and we're working with a group of young people to help us start to develop that and what questions they might have. And if there's any interested parties here that would like to be involved in that, pop your email in the chat box and we'll be in touch.
Yeah, that'd be brilliant. And we're updating the planner for CETR. So this is the booklet that goes out to people who are going to have a CETR or a CTR to help them understand and to get the support they need to really be involved on the day. And also that will help family members as well, because it's so important that people are involved. And we're also trying to find a provider at the moment. So again, if anybody's on the call today who works in a provider, we really need to update our provider booklet, but we'd like it to be led by a provider. So if anybody has works anywhere that they think might be interested in supporting us with that, that would be great. We've talked quite a bit about the toolkit. So we listened when people came back to us and said, actually, this policy is really quite complicated, and what we need to do is to be able to pull out the bits that are important to us. So rather than leaving it as a big policy, we developed the code of practice. Well, Scarlett really developed and led on the code of practice, which is a step-by-step guide, really. For someone like me, when I first joined the team, what I really needed was a walkthrough. So this is the person, and how the DSR might support them, and how it should work and who should be involved. Then moving on to the point where that person then becomes RED, and they'll should have a care and treatment review, and then how that works and the way it works through and how they should link in together. So that's fantastic. And what we're really looking at doing for people within integrated care systems, people within providers, is sharing good practice, because I think some examples that people have that they already have in place, it's fantastic to be able to link those people up. And training. So we're working with Minded, and we have had some expert reference groups, and we're working with them to develop the mandatory modules for panel members. It's become more, not to surprise everyone on the call, more than what we originally set out to do, because there are so many crossover elements. So we're just looking at how we can do that and how that can sit on a platform. Do you want to do the comms bit, Scarlett?
Yeah, absolutely. What we recognise is that certainly the Learning Disability and Autism Programme absolutely recognises that the DSR CETR policy is kind of the cornerstone for understanding the needs of people with learning disabilities and autism. That's exactly what the DSR is about, is identifying need, knowing and understanding your population, and the CETR is about how can you in your system support people with learning disabilities, autism, or both, and keep them well in community. So from the autism, we're really going to ramp up some of our kind of comms around the policy. And as we touched on already, we know that primary care is a key partner in this, to be aware of, to be more aware of DSR and CTR. So we'll be looking at how we can really engage with those teams and other parts of the system. So thinking about social prescribing as well. So yeah, there's going to be a bit more comms coming out in the autumn through to winter. So yeah, keep your eyes peeled.
Yeah, and I think the really important thing about that is, like we've said, Scarlett and I spend a lot of our time preaching to the converted. So we now need to go out and work with other people who don't necessarily know. So I guess a prime example is I'm adult nurse by background, and I've worked in urgent emergency care before. So I've worked in A&E departments, and actually, wouldn't it be fantastic if an autistic person in crisis came into the A&E department, and the people and the team who were working knew that the best thing that they could do for that person is to support them to have a care, education and treatment review, because we don't get bogged down on the data in the national team, but what we do know, and what we're not very good at getting the message out about, is how positive community CETRs and CTRs are, and how well they work. And actually 80% of people, if they have them, don't get admitted. So Sue North, who's one of our SROs, senior responsible officers, so she leads on this work along with Christine Bakewell. When we had our last steering group, it was really empowering to listen to her talk about how we need to change the narrative and how we need to share the fantastic work that people are doing. So say, for example, you lead on the dynamic support register in a place that actually, if your person is escalating, then maybe when they're going to primary care and have their annual health check, the practice nurse will contact you to say, I'm really worried about this person, and I think maybe it would be beneficial if they have a care, education and treatment review. So the comms team, we're really looking at doing a really big positive piece of work. So it's fantastic that we've had the opportunity to come and speak to you guys today. And absolutely, Scarlett and I would really like to hear from anyone if they have groups of people who maybe we wouldn't necessarily think about, who we could go out and engage with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you ever so much, both of you. That's great.
Right,
there's some questions in the chat, and so if you could respond, that would be brilliant. Can I just ask a couple of quick questions? And these are things that we've noticed are happening in local systems. And so in terms of people who may be detained in hospital on a Section 47, or people who are under really tight restrictions on a Section 49. Would we be right in thinking that CETR or that CTR process is about checking the quality, checking the treatment, and that's reasonably adjusted, and then collectively making sense of what might happen at the end of that person's tariff or at the end of treatment if the person's returned into prison?
Chloe and I had a bit of a chat about this before we came on, and I think we have got a bit of an email because prior to publication, we did have a lot of conversations with our health and justice colleagues who also work in NHS England. It is a big challenge and it is really complex. And I think you're absolutely right, Nikki. It's about checking quality. It isn't challenging or making any changes to what the justice system has imposed. We have no say or dictation or direction over that. And I think it's about that kind of personalisation and that checking quality. It's appropriate, but recognising that the CTR DSR process has in no way a capacity to trump anything that's happened within the health and justice arena. Chloe, I don't know if you've got anything else to add.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess for me, and for when we've discussed it with the health and justice team within NHS England, we've really kind of had conversations with them around the considerations of how the policy should be implemented when individuals are transferred from prison settings to hospitals. So we recognise that actually sometimes, although not often when people are transferred, then once that person is admitted to hospital, that generally they won't have that pre-admission, because it's a different context. It's not about supporting that person in the community. However, I think from work that we've done and pilots that we've done looking around at things like clinical contracts, it's about ensuring that that person at that time is getting the therapeutic care and treatment that they need to have whilst they are in hospital. And as that person, as an individual's pathway changes, so I know, Nikki, that you were talking about how that person may be in hospital when actually things change, then the CETR and the CTR would change to suit that person's need. The majority of the times that person would be in a secure inpatient setting. And I think one of the things in the discussions that we've had as well is around a piece of work that we're about to start looking at, which is around people having like changing the timelines for CTRs. So a person within a secure setting has them currently every 12 months, but would it be of benefit to that person actually if they had them at 6 months? I mean, I think what some people came back and said is that these are our people most at risk, and we recognise that through the safe and wellbeing reviews. But I really think it's that individual approach around where that person is, both on their pathway as to why they were admitted into hospital in the first place, and then their pathway through the justice systems. So we kind of go back and forth and are going to have these conversations with the health and justice team when we do this wider comms piece of work. But really, I think what Scarlett said is that once this person gets to hospital, the independent panel and the responsible commissioner would always be very mindful of supporting that person in a way that didn't overlap.
And I suppose some of it's also about finding that balance between the people who are now at their end of their tariff. So
absolutely,
we know in some areas there are examples where people may have stolen a bike and 20 years later are still in hospital. And so where people's tariff may have ended through the criminal justice system,
absolutely,
who should be our priority, and those people who are serving a life sentence, who we need to keep an eye on. But the reality is they're going to remain in that criminal justice setting for some time.
Absolutely. And I think the work that we're doing, so we're looking at doing work with the prison healthcare services to ensure that they kind of know that if a person is being considered from transfer from hospital back to prison, that they will have had a CETR review, and there may be recommendations that. So it's that two-way conversation really, and it's so how we can build as part of our comms campaign around what we can do to explore the work that we can do together to support that person, and how we can potentially include these things in the forms that prisons use for transfer process, specifically for people who may have autism or a learning disability.
And just as a bit of an aside to that, I've been doing some work with the Children and Young People's Health and Justice team to look at the autism training framework, which is linked to the Oliver McGowan training, which I suspect most people will have heard of. And it's how we can roll that out across our kind of youth justice services. So it will be in the youth offending institutions, the SARC, which is the sexual assault referral centres, all of Secure Estate, and there's two other services that I've just lost out of my head right now, but I will come back to you with that. And we're looking to roll that out from early in the new year. But that will include a bit of a focus on DSR, CETR processes, as well as everything else that's learning disability and autism related. So we do anticipate more questions will be asked locally. And this policy isn't to override what happens in the criminal justice system. This is about identification. This is about knowing needs and offering additional support where it would be appropriate and effective to do so.
That's brilliant. Thank you ever so much. There's lots of questions in the chat, and so what we're going to do is Chloe and Scarlett are going to respond to some of those questions, and we'll pop a question and answer deck out with the recording and also with the slides, so that everybody's got those. On the back of this session, you're all going to receive an evaluation to complete. And within that, there's the option for 6 local areas to nominate themselves to join 4 peer-to-peer learning sets. So if you're looking at developing your work in your local area around the Dynamic Support Register, around care education treatment reviews, around care and treatment reviews, or if you've got some particularly sticky issues that you're working through at the moment, that you'd welcome joining a 4-session peer group to discuss and improve things in your local area. There's an option within the evaluation feedback for you to nominate your local system, and so do bear that in mind as we hear from the presenters today, if that's something that you're working through at the moment and you'd be interested in. So thank you ever so much, Chloe and Scarlett. That's been really, really helpful. Lots of questions and feedback in the chat. And now we're going to hear from Nori Munir and Kevin Beveridge from Cornwall Council and Cornwall and the Asa Scilly ICB, who are going to talk about the work they've been doing in Cornwall to improve outcomes for people with a learning disability and autistic people, with consideration of dynamic support registers and CTRs and things. Thanks ever so much, Kevin and Nori.
Thank you. I'll make a start. But Kevin, please do feel free to chip in. We're discussing briefly just how we're going to structure this. It might be a bit free-flowing, and I only had one job before this presentation, which was to produce a presentation, and I've rather let my local authority colleagues down on that front. So forgive the brevity of our slides. We're from the Cornwall and Asa Scilly Integrated Care System. I think we've been asked to talk about our implementation of DSR and CETR and admission avoidance because of our current lower figures of people using out of area hospital and in area hospital. And so while we're not a perfect system by any means, it's given us pause for thought to look at all the ingredients that you need in place in order to avoid over-escalation or hospitalisation of people. I think that's not the right slide. Do you have the Cornwall and Asa Scilly slide there? Oh, maybe I'm not seeing it. Are you seeing it?
No, I'm not saying.
Sorry, Nikki, do you have the? Fantastic. Could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Thank you. So this is a bit of a dry bit, and I've recycled a slide just to give you a picture of where our current dynamic support register position is. And I noticed that the baseline from NHS England around dynamic support register and CETR implementation absolutely nailed where we are in terms of it's almost like you've been reading my emails, because particularly in terms of the self-referral systems, but also the oversight panel in terms of reference, etc. There's still a bit of work to be done down in Cornwall. But so we've gone along with the May implementation, and we have a multi-agency team that meets every 2 weeks. And I think today is about emphasising that multi-agency nature of our working around the DSR. So the lead operational learning disability social worker is always attending or a representative at those 2 weekly meetings, along with our health providers from both learning disability field and people who provide services for autistic people. And that's so far proving an effective panel in terms of oversight of our colleagues' work. We currently got actually I think it's 24 individuals, so that's not a lot of people, but that's building as people get more knowledge of our system. 24 individuals on our dynamic support register, and we've now, as I understand it, held 6 community care and treatment reviews since the implementation, and I'll come on to issues around consent, because we're often awaiting consent. And our first oversight panel is due to happen in September. So if we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Thank you. So one of our future actions is to get a website page that's for people to self-refer into, and also for professionals to refer into. So at the moment it's quite clunky, although the forms are good and straightforward and provide us with a good risk analysis. They're not part of a wider clinical system that I think we need to develop in order to keep records more securely, and also making more sense to people referring themselves in. And in addition, we need to get more training out there for both our local authority and health colleagues. And as you've pointed out before, and Kevin and I were talking during the NHS England presentation around the awareness of primary care of this system as they get more and more involved, rather than relying on specialist services. Our risks and challenges, and I think they reflect what was on the NHS England baseline return, was knowledge of that of the process. So often people aren't aware of the process, and it's difficult to know when people aren't aware of the process because they're not getting in touch with us. So we don't really have a sense of how many people are getting missed at this point. Updated assessments, so people are very busy, and again, not quite in the habit of making sure that when people are on the register that we're getting that real-time update, so that we know when to apply specific effort in across our cases. So for instance, this week, I know our panel that there'll be 2 people that we are particularly concerned about that we're going to focus on during our panel, and then and what we need is really good data and updates to make sure that we're not missing anyone else. Consent's been really inconsistent for both DSRs and CETRs, in that people are still struggling to understand the collaborative and the engaged process that we have with the people that this is about, and how that full consent is really necessary. So we're still struggling and won't proceed with blue light meetings or CTRs without really thorough capacity assessment and consent records, but it's still really challenging for people to see that shift from MDTs that are about people to CTRs and blue light meetings that are with people. It's taking a while for people to understand that shift, and also, yeah, they're just obtaining dates is a real challenge for us. There were a few more things that I just wanted to pick up before we, because Kevin's got loads more to say about this. But just before we move on, I noticed there was questions about advocacy in the chat. And so we've commissioned locally peer advocates that work specifically with individuals that have been admitted into our local and out of area, if that happens, psychiatric hospital settings. So we have peer advocates that have experienced hospital themselves that go either virtually or in person, go and visit people that are currently inpatient to add to our quality checking of hospital environments, as well as inform us around individual issues that might come up that people haven't felt happy to talk to our clinical reviewers about. That's proving really effective, and although it's been a pilot, we're looking to procure that for the long term, because it's been invaluable in terms of the disclosure that we get from people who are current inpatients to people that they know have experienced similar environments. We're redeveloping our forensic offer, community offer, to try and get upstream of people before they get to the CTR process. And we're using our funding transfer agreements monies that some commissioners in here might be aware of, that were legacy monies given by NHS England to the ICBs, and we're going to co-opt that to expand our forensic offer, so that we're not just working with the sort of higher end of forensic, but to reach into people that are likely to offend. Trying to see if there's anything I've missed on the technical stuff. I've just written replication in capital letters. So in our DSR panels, what we try not to do is case manage, but to make sure that we're managing the case managers. So that's why there's very senior operational people within that panel every 2 weeks, because it's very much in their interest to get ahead of people who are starting to experience more risk. I'm sure there's other stuff that we should be getting in, but I will next slide, please, and I'll hand over to Kevin.
Thanks, Norrie. Yep. Oh. Yeah. Well, slides moving forward fast and furious here. I just wanted to put into context some of the things that we have found extremely helpful to supporting those technical changes, supporting greater joint working between the local authority and our colleagues in health and within the wider ICB. One of the things I do want to call out as particularly helpful was the Building the Right Support peer review, which we were supported by the LGA colleagues and NHS colleagues to have in Cornwall last year. So in 2022, we had our peer review in July, and it coincided with quite a significant period of change in the local authority at a very senior level. A new incoming strategic director, for example, in Ali Bullman, and that has been a catalyst overall across our system to support the direction of travel, the identification of the right priorities, and the support for what came out of the peer review as the most significant areas of challenge for Cornwall. Most notably, what the peer review challenged us to do in a more progressive, longer term approach was to flip our system from being very much service centric to being led by the people with the lived experience and family carers, to put them at the heart of everything that we actually do in Cornwall. And that direction of travel was agreed within the council's oversight and scrutiny processes and has been built into the activities, the specific activities, one of which is the review that is currently underway and is actually coming to a positive conclusion of the partnership board, our LD partnership board in particular in this case. It was identified as an area that people felt it was difficult to participate in. It was difficult to make a positive impact, and a real challenge around holding the various stakeholders to account for things that we might promise to do, but they could see very little evidence of progress, very little evidence of measuring the impact and reporting in a positive way on things that might be changing. So the review of the partnership board, and in fact, all of the activities that have come out of the peer review have been co-designed, co-produced across a really diverse experience base. It would be very tempting, wouldn't it, after a peer review when you hold the mirror up and you see things that you don't necessarily like, for you as an individual stakeholder to go, these are our priorities. We resisted the temptation to go into action planning mode and solution focus mode, and we created a vehicle called Making Good Change Happen. We've been supported by expert external facilitators from a range of backgrounds to support us to put that challenge back to us as a whole system. And we've used a really good planning framework. Some of you will know it, the Keys to Citizenship, and it's seven areas of focus to look at things that are a priority to the people who access and receive support services across Cornwall. The outcome from that, the endorsement of that, the ownership of that will again sit within that reconvened partnership board, and we will be held to account for what we do as a council, what the ICB does as its own self, and what our community health provider does. But also we've been very careful to make sure that our providers who are front and centre at delivering the care and support across Cornwall are fully involved. They have the opportunity to be more involved and create a bit of a dynamic around change. We're describing it as a movement for positive change in Cornwall that is not simply owned by ourselves as statutory services, that it's owned and underpinned by the people who use and benefit from the approaches that we develop. And I felt it was really important to put DSRs, CUTRs into that cultural context. For me, fundamental to all of this is making sure that we all have a seat at the right table, that we can facilitate the access to the various meetings, to the panels, to the discussions that our frontline professional teams and leaders actually require. And there is a significant piece of work that I'm leading on to look at the offer around learning disability and autism in Cornwall that will underpin our decisions around the type of structure, the type of supports, and the type of joint working that we can do going forward. So I'm going to pass on to Norrie for the last bullet point.
Thanks, Kevin. And I think it's, and I suppose what's most impact. Nikki was asking sort of what is the key to, and I'm always hesitant to say it because people have emergencies for all sorts of reasons, but what's the key to sort of more success in Cornwall in terms of particularly preventing people going into hospital and especially out of area hospital? And I think that's around really clear joint working and joint unacceptance of unnecessary hospital admission. So we are, as a health as an ICB, absolutely not accepting of people being sent to out of area hospitals, because I've never known a good outcome of someone being sent away from their home to a hospital. But the council is equally unaccepting of that. And when our clinical reviewer from the ICB goes to see people in out of area hospitals, they go in the same car as a specific social worker whose sole purpose is to make sure that people aren't going into hospital, and when they do, coming out quickly. So they work completely jointly, and that's funded by our community discharge grant from the local authority, that social worker that solely works to get people out of county. And the other thing is that we work closely as commissioning bodies as well. That's Kevin there. We sit next to each other a lot, and make sure that we're not making decisions without each other. And as a result of that, we have a number of joint and co-produced initiatives. So we've got a small supports program that we're working with the NDTI, which is trying to address the biggest challenge that we have in Cornwall, which is around housing and care. One or the other, one can't happen without the other, and we struggle on both fronts at the moment in terms of robust and resilient providers of compassionate and safe care. And also we've had a whole plethora of engagement events over the last year and a half, since there's been renewed leadership within our local authority that's really keen to make sure that we're bound at the hip in terms of everything that we do. So Kevin, even though he sits in the local authority, will talk about annual health checks. Probably I need to start talking more about them than him, because it's getting embarrassing. But so there's a real understanding of that health and social care need being our joint responsibility. I've gone on way too much. Nikki, how much time do you want us to carry on for, or are we happy to start wrapping it up?
We're happy to wrap it up.
That's great. Thank you ever so much, and thank you also for sharing about your social worker who's been working alongside health colleagues to enable people to be discharged from hospital more rapidly. That's really helpful.
It's hard to imagine how we wouldn't have that post now. It's once you've got one, you can't give them up.
So there's a question about the just checking whether or not is your DSR all age, and is that right that there's only 24 people on that?
So I've written in capital letters on page 1 of my notes here, just adults. So we're talking today about the adult DSR. There is a children's DSR, which it operates slightly differently, although we're planning to integrate at the end of this year. And that was around provider appetite to take on the DSR for the ICB. But as people may be aware, ICBs are slightly shrinking. And so we're going to need to look to our providers for help in terms of how that DSR is held. I would say, however, the fact that it's held within the ICB by my assistant, Paula, who some people will know, is critical for getting those, bringing everyone to the table. So we've got no problem with engagement from all of our operational colleagues in health and social care. When it sits with one element of those, that might become more problematic, I'm not sure.
Brilliant. That's really helpful. Thank you. There's a couple of other questions popped up in the chat. Will the funding of the social worker become a permanent post now that the community discharge grant has ended?
Very specific.
Yeah. So part of the work I'm looking at, some of the work that our strategic director has tasked me to do, is very much about making sure that we do not lose that specialist knowledge, that skill set, that appetite for integrated working with our community health provider. All of that is part of what I'm planning to do. So I suppose that's a very long-winded way of saying I have no intention of losing that particular post. And interestingly, I was saying to Nori earlier on that we're looking to develop a similar post on the autistic side of the equation, as it were, because we know that there's a huge amount of development work that needs to be done, particularly with the Autistic Partnership in Cornwall, which is a really fantastic organisation. Another one of those social movements that is going to change positively the experience of people in Cornwall. So absolutely, we're always looking at opportunities to build on what we've created. And Norrie, I'm going to remind him that he said he might even jointly fund that autism post. So you heard that here first, Nikki. You can hold him to account.
Fantastic, that's great. Thank you ever so much, both of you. Really appreciate your time and sharing some of the work that's going on in Cornwall together. That's brilliant. Thank you. So next we're going to hear, we're really fortunate to have two amazing mums join us today to talk about their experience of their children having a CTR. And so first of all, I'm going to talk to Alison, who hopefully is still on here and can. Fabulous. Oh, we don't need that one just yet more, thanks. Thank you ever so much more. Hi, Alison. Thank you ever so much for joining us. Oh, hopefully Amor can take that down for a second. Thanks. Hi, Alison. Thank you ever so much for joining us. And so I hope people can bear with us. I've met up with Alison and Faye, and so what we're going to do is just have a chat around a couple of questions that came up as we've been spending a bit of time together over the last couple of weeks about their experiences of the care and treatment review, care education treatment reviews for their loved ones. So Alison, thank you ever so much for joining us. So can you tell us a bit about when you first heard about care education and treatment reviews?
So my daughter, who's now 17, she was 15 at the time and admitted. And after 6 weeks of her being in hospital, I was signposted to the CETR, which I'd never heard of before. And they did the review while she was an inpatient. That was the first review. And then that continued as on a regular occurrence and into our post-discharge. And it was really, I said to them at the end of it, because she's in a good place now, everything we've had support, the CETRs have been the most helpful.
What was it in particular? Was there one particular thing, or was there a whole range of things that really helped from the CETR that really helped move things forward and change things for your daughter?
I think it's a mixture. First of all, you're talking to people that get it. So it's not an experience most of your friends and family have ever been through, and I've never experienced it before. So you're being told things by a hospital and professionals, and you're none the wiser. So they can tell you absolutely anything, and you're kind of agreeing, but you're not sure whether it's right or not. I know we've got Google, and I did spend a lot of time researching and making sure I knew what was right. But when you face to the professionals that are on your side, it makes such a difference, especially the lived experience. They knew what I was going through. They were patient. They could signpost different things when I needed it. So a couple of examples of signposting was sensory processing disorder. Has she ever had a diagnosis, which she hasn't? And we're on a waiting list now because of the CETR. She had braces at the time. She was an inpatient, and one of the things they did was push to get her seen because she was a flight risk. She didn't want to be in hospital, so any opportunity to escape she would. So they were saying it wasn't safe for her to leave the hospital, and I was like, that's not right. She has the right to be seen by a dentist. These braces should be checked every 6 weeks. Like, she's been there for 4 months now. They're not doing anything apart from metal digging into her gums, which isn't okay. So they pushed, and they did eventually take her, but it was a lot. I mean, it was almost discharge day by the time that happened, but they made it happen. It's just having someone on your side, really, the understanding, and making the hospital accountable. So yes, they'd say they'd do things, but you don't know how quickly they're supposed to do it. So they say, oh, this will be in place, but it could be 6 months, it could be 6 weeks. You just don't know how the process works. So they would come and the hospital would say they'd do it, but they knew how quickly that should happen. And usually it was quicker because of the CETR.
That's really helpful to hear about, Alison. Thank you. So is there anything else that would have really made a difference to you and your family around the DSR or CTR?
After listening to the professionals now, the DSR I'd never heard of. So I think one of the biggest things probably would have prevented an inpatient stay. One, if she could been diagnosed as autistic before she was 15. People had suspicions that she could be on the spectrum from year 4. Teachers were too scared to say the word autism. I'm a teacher, I worked at the school, so they were worried of that. Oh, we couldn't possibly tell her that you might have an autistic child. I think autism is seen as a disability too much. I don't see Ella's perfectly capable of living her life. She just has additional needs. She doesn't need me 100% of the time. She just needs that safety net. If someone had said it sooner, we could have got a diagnosis sooner. With that diagnosis, someone could have flagged up what a DSR is. And I don't think she would have gone into hospital. It was the lack of support around her needs that I think ended her being in the hospital, because she just had everybody telling her she wasn't good enough, she couldn't do things, and we didn't know why. And my understanding of autism now is so different to what it was 20 years ago. I mean, the only autistic person I've probably ever seen was Rain Man, and that's what I thought an autistic person was. And when they said she could be ASD, and I'm like, really? And then did my research, read loads, and you're like, it's so obvious, like from birth, if I had that information. The other things we've had that were really helpful, not necessarily for CETR, but when she went to A&E, I heard someone say if A&E could signpost DSR, that would have been amazing. They didn't know or didn't realise, but they did find us family support workers. They were called Kelwell. It's an agency, and they've been a godsend. They were put in place post-discharge and supported the family, mostly Ella, but they were here for us too. So she could live her life without me being there 24/7. So they would take her to the stables, which is her passion. And that keeps her happy, stable, very stable than horses. But they could do the transport. What would have been even better if NHS and social care could have worked together, because there were so many rows of who was going to pay for it, which obviously made things take longer than necessary, because social care really didn't want to pick up the bill. They said it was all health. So that would have been better if that could have been done. I can't think of anything else to add. I think early diagnosis is key though.
Can I just check? We talked about funding beyond a discharge. Was that ever talked about in the CTRs?
So as she was coming to discharge, they flagged up section 117, which I'd never heard of. And everyone knows section. People were saying, what do you need? And we're like, well, I've never been in this situation before. I don't know what I need. What is there available? Well, it depends what you want. So no one could really say, well, this is somebody else's experience. It really helped them because they had this, that, and the other. Although that funding's there, they're still not forward enough on letting you get to it. So it's not given to me directly. No one really knows what it's for. So I think the Kelwell were funded through section 117 in the end, but I couldn't tell you that for definite because I'm not involved in that funding, but it came from somewhere. There needs to be some sort of document where families know the sort of things that people can access. Nikki sent me some links now, which I've read through, and things like her being taken to the stables and the taxi there was funded by 117, but trying to get a taxi. Well, I don't know why I couldn't have just had that funding to, I know it'd have been much quicker for me to do it myself. I know all parents aren't able to do that, but I would have been able to. She also has an assistance dog. So when she's wanted a dog for a long time. So when she turned 16, she was still in hospital. So her present was a dog for when she's discharged. She wanted a German Shepherd. So when she was discharged, the week she discharged, that we were signposted by a dog trainer that happens to be a friend. She trains a lady that is linked to a charity called RAD, which is Recovery Assistance Dogs. And they help you train your own dog, and they promote rescues to become a fully qualified assistance dog. And she is giving her a focus, and he has done his intermediate and advanced training and passed. So public access is the last stepping stone for him. He's amazing. So, but she works really hard to train him. And because she has an autistic personality, when she's told to do something, she does it to the best of her ability, and she does it correctly. So any other young people out there, and I know autistic people often have a passion for animals, if they want a dog and they think to train it themselves, definitely 100%. Gives her a reason to get up in the morning. She wouldn't even leave the house before because she was scared people would look at her, stare at her. We live in a community where she was excluded from the school because they thought her behaviour was bad, even though they thought she was autistic and undiagnosed. They still pushed her out. But now she'll go out into that community. She doesn't mind if she sees people because she has that dog by her side. And I can't emphasize how amazing those two are together. And I'm sure there's other young people that would experience the same, but I do think they have to be older, like 16 plus, because they have to take the responsibility themselves.
That sounds fantastic, Alison. Thank you ever so much. And is there anything else that you'd want to tell people that are working in local systems just to bear in mind that would help families and in particular children and young people?
An early diagnosis if possible. I know the funding's not there and the waiting lists are terrible, but she wouldn't have been an inpatient if that had happened sooner, which I'm sure would have saved you a ton of money. And the DSR sounds amazing. If I'd only known about that, I mean, she wasn't diagnosed, so I guess she wouldn't have had access to it. But you're saying accident and emergency places should signpost, 100% should signpost, and even SEMH schools. If her school had known, perhaps we could have been signposted from that. That's definitely. And then on discharge, she had an exit plan and also a kind of SOS plan. So discharge wasn't plain sailing. She did run off and she was Section 136 by police every now and then. But the CTR said, let's have a plan. So they knew her need. So we had a laminate A4 sheet that we kept with us. And I could hand to the police, which said, I am autistic. I'm not stupid. You don't have to talk to me like a child. I will lash out, but it's not me. And the more the police got to know her, the better the outcomes were, because they had to restrain her to stop her hurting herself, but she doesn't like being touched. So it was a no-win situation, but she's getting better understanding them and they're getting a better understanding her, and touch wood, we've had a fantastic 6 months and hopefully it will last.
Thank you ever so much, Alison, for your time. Really, really appreciate it. And hopefully there's some really clear messages in there that people can take away and think about in their local systems about how they can make a difference to families. Thank you ever so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So now we're going to have a chat with Faye, and then Faye's wants us to finish up with a final slide. So thank you ever so much, Faye, for your time. And so can you tell us a bit about your first hearing about CTRs or dynamic support registers?
I suppose it's a little bit different to Alison. My son was under Tier 3 mental health services from a very young age, from the age of 3. And at one point, and we were sort of in and out, and at one point he was discharged from CAMHS whilst he was still under the care of the crisis team. I knew he still needed help, so I objected, and it took 5 months for a complaint to be heard. When we went to make our complaint and have that meeting, it was very obvious to the man who was leading on CAMHS that my son shouldn't have been discharged from his service. And it was then they said, it was sort of put to me, we don't know what to do, we're going to call a CETR. So I knew nothing until that point. I knew it as something which was going to have a look and see what could be done, because nobody seemed to know. And I think the first CETR we had was an in-person one, and it was the first meeting that my son actually stayed in. He was a teenager by then. He'd never stayed in a meeting ever, and I think it was because it had been put to him that what he had to say was important, and it was obvious that they actually wanted to know, they actually wanted to understand what was important to him, and that made a difference. And he actually stayed in the meeting and told them, and I was really proud of him. And then he said his bit, and then he went, right, I'm done now, and walked out. But we'd already agreed that, and they were fine with it. And I think that's also important, because we had the same team, not the expert by experience or the clinical expert, but the core team. We had Julia and Caroline, and we had them consistently throughout all of the community CETRs. So he felt like they understood him and they knew him. Yeah, so that's how I first came to sort of hear of them. And I think the thing which strikes me, and still strikes me now, is the structure. Because you go in and the family's heard first. Most meetings you go to, the professionals meet without the family. They'll have their talk, and then they will meet with the family, and it feels, you know, whether they want it to feel like that or not, it feels like they are going to try and convince you of their plan of action. Whereas with the CETR, you know, and some of those professionals hadn't seen you in months. The CETR were getting what is happening right now, and it was current. What is happening? Where are things going? Where are we going? Where are we starting from? And that made a big difference to me. That built my confidence a little bit in the system there as well.
So what was it within those CTRs or CETRs that really helped you and your family, that made a difference?
I think we had one meeting, and it was the expert by experience who was there. We'd never been able to get, there was something, my son kept going on about a timetable at school, and we never got to the bottom of it, and everyone sort of nodded and smiled at him. And this man sat next to him and took that time to really understand what he was trying to say. And actually what came out was, it wasn't about this lesson where it was on a timetable at all. It was about a far wider situation, and that then changed the whole CETR and actually the whole understanding of what his behaviours were trying to communicate. And I think that made a big difference. Just, yeah, taking that time. And I think you can't discount that impact that he had. I can't remember the man's name, but I can remember how he made my son feel. And that had a massive impact. And I think the other one was, another time was, we'd gone into a meeting and nobody had understood the wider implications. There's a big push in safeguarding at the moment where I am about think family, but nobody had understood that. Sorry, my computer's saying it's going to shut itself off in a minute. That's helpful. And so the CTR got that. They understood the wider implications. I had a daughter, well, I still have a daughter, who's younger than my boy. She was under the care at the time that all this was going on. She was under the care from Royal London Hospital for one condition, and Great Ormond Street Hospital for another one. And that had been ongoing for quite a few years. So she was quite poorly. And nobody actually understood that and that extra impact. And it wasn't until the CTR actually spoke in their professionals meeting, I didn't realise that conversation had happened until I got a phone call from my son's care coordinator, who actually said, I didn't realise, and I'm sorry. And that had a big impact, because she changed how she was working with us from then on, because she had a deeper understanding of what was happening and what was needed. And that, for a professional to have the courage, and I think that takes a lot of courage for them to turn around and say, I didn't realise, I'm sorry, I want to try and sort of move things forward. And it did. That did move things forward. That had a big impact. So I think, however the CTR managed to take my ramblings and sort of professionalise them and put them to somebody else as almost like a middle person, was really, really useful in sort of getting that wider message across.
So when we were chatting earlier in the week, and we were talking about what would really make what else would have really made a difference to you and your family, in terms of that CTR and that preventing of your son needing to go into hospital. So what would really have made a difference?
What would really have made a difference would be, nobody seemed to know what it was. Nobody knew it was the at-risk of admission register by then. Nobody understood what it was. I didn't understand what it was. It was just a buzzword which had been floated in front of me. Nobody understood what it was. We had CTRs where education refused to attend. To me, it's a safeguarding risk, and I say it's a safeguarding risk because my son's life was at stake, and that's what people hadn't realised. So I think some understanding of, actually, by the time a CTR was being called, we were at crisis point by that point, and people didn't seem to know. My son was admitted to a Tier 4 psychiatric unit without a social worker, because social care had refused to do an assessment. They had been asked to do an assessment, but they had refused. I think if they'd understood the seriousness of actually him being on what was then, I suppose, moved on to the DSR, and having had CTRs, they perhaps would have had a different view, because that then caused delays. There doesn't seem to be, the CTR makes recommendations, but it's up to the individual professionals about how seriously they take those recommendations. And there's been many a time where there's been quite significant delays in the recommendations being actioned. But when the recommendations were actioned, there was quite a significant benefit, which may, and if people could have seen that earlier, all of that delay, all of that wasted time, you know, I do believe that had some of those recommendations not been delayed, perhaps the admission could have been avoided. He's entitled to 117 aftercare, although nobody seems to know what that means. But again, if you're looking at sort of a cost factor, it certainly costs a lot more to put right, you know, the delays than it does to actually to prevent the, you know, the admission. So I think that they don't, people just don't seem to understand it, and the seriousness of it and the importance. And I think it needs to be placed on the same importance as child protection, because of the seriousness of the risk to life, really. So I think, yeah, that would have helped. And the understanding, I know the CTR did a lot of work, his last CTR, about helping the professionals understand what 117 aftercare was. However, now we've done the transition into adult services weren't there. So that learning which has happened has been lost and hasn't followed through in that transition. So yeah, I think some more joined up people working together more would have massive benefits for the outcomes.
Now, am I right in thinking, Faye, that your son transitioned into adult services shortly after being discharged from hospital?
Yes, he was discharged from hospital at the end of last year, and he turned 18 at the end of March. So part of his what we had was, so we had the inpatient, had a lot of community CTRs over a number of years. Then we had the inpatient CTR. Then we had a post-discharge community CTR, and now we're in sort of adult services. Now the CTRs themselves have all very much focused on that transition and what's been done to support that transition, but it hasn't quite sort of come over into the services. So we've got lots of documents saying what needs to happen, but unfortunately a lot of it hasn't happened. I'm still waiting on actions which were given to children's social care in when he was an inpatient, have still not been done, and obviously he's not under children's social care anymore, and we're nearly a year post discharge. So there's been some gaps, but I do think the gaps have come from a lack of knowledge and a lack of understanding. Yeah, and that did cause a lot of delays. He was a delayed discharge because of that. Yeah.
Thanks ever so much, Faye. He's doing well now.
He is. We are managing. We are hopeful. We're hopeful, shall we say? We just remain hopeful. I've got a lot of professional experience before having children working in autism hubs, resource units and all sorts. So we're in quite a fortunate position that I had a lot of understanding sort of beforehand, so I can sort of manage most things. So I think hopefully we're slowly getting somewhere.
Good. And Faye, you kindly put together a slide, which I'm hoping my colleague Amor can just pop up for us for you to describe what's going on it. We've got that final slide, Amor. Thank you. Faye, I'll leave you to describe what's going on there.
Yeah, it's just how it felt. Before we had a CTR, the quotes around there are quotes which I was told, and it felt like the whole world was just closing in on us. I was completely overwhelmed. I'm a lone parent. I had more than Sam. One thing I was actually told was his sister is not our concern, but she was my concern and she was Sam's concern. I was told to stay home from work. It wasn't possible. I'm a lone parent and the only income is my income. I was actually told that I was his only protective factor. That's a massive responsibility to put onto somebody. You are the only reason your son is alive and don't mess up. At one point, somebody stood outside my front door and went, well, it's coming up to 5 o'clock. We can't do any more today. Good luck with your child who's going to try and kill themselves tonight. But we're clocking off. How am I meant to keep my son safe? I was told there were no mental health difficulties. I think that was 2 weeks before 24/7 2-to-1 care was put in the house just to keep him alive. I was told he was not engaging and they were going to discharge because he was not engaging. So the problem was his for not engaging. When actually he was unable to engage because he was becoming so very, very ill. I was told if I locked away all the knives, cleaning equipment and medicines, they would be able to discharge. It's your fault. We need to discharge. And what I think when I look back was happening, I think a lot of the professionals were feeling quite scared because they had a child they couldn't help. but they forgot that they had a family who was still stuck in it, which was even scarier for us. And the next part of it is the CTR, who actually then said to the professor, hold on a minute, you're asking Miss Mum to work full time, stay awake all night, 24/7. And you wouldn't ask a care worker to do that, it would be illegal. You know, it's impossible what you're putting on her. And then she's got to try and be a parent to her son as well, and her daughter, who's got her own needs. It's too much. And I think maybe everybody had just narrowed in their focus. And what the CTR did was open it up and said, what is possible? What is be asking too much? Let's look at this and let's find something sustainable. And they just really sort of like came into the middle with me and saw it from where we were. And that was, yeah, it just really helped. And that started things shifting. And like I say, you know, especially that his sister is not our concern. It was that woman who then phoned me up and actually apologised and said she hadn't realised. So that actually created some change. You know, and that's just how one way in which I've experienced it.
Thank you so much, Faye, for sharing that. The comments in the chat to both yourself and Alison, people have really appreciated hearing the difference that's made to your families. And I think from listening to that and those conversations, there's clearly things that local systems can go away and think about making sure that all partners understand about the dynamic support register and the care and treatment reviews across education, health, social care, and into those more particular health services like A&E and GPs. I would hope that people would also go away and think about how they can bridge that gap between young people's services and adult services, and that change in some of those legal frameworks that people sit within as a child and then going into adulthood, and how they can make sure that some of those things are smoothed over. I think it's interesting that there's conversations about Section 117 funding, and making sure that we've got information there for families and for professionals around how that can be used for children, young people, as well as adults. And so hopefully hearing about those things have been really helpful to you. And I can see that lots of people are saying that hearing from yourselves, Faye and Alison, have been particularly helpful. And yeah, I'll just pick out from Sarah's comment. You've both done an amazing job presenting your thoughts to us, and so they just want to thank you. So thank you ever so much. I think there we go. Okay, so if people have any additional questions, then do feel free to pop them in the chat, and we will get our speakers to respond to those. People will receive a copy of the recording, and the recording will also be popped online with the slides and with the questions and answers. We've got 2 more sessions coming up. We've got a session with a limited number of places talking about human rights, and the British Institute for Human Rights are going to be running that. Unfortunately, that's a session that we're not allowed to record. And so I'd suggest that if you're really keen on hearing about that, then registering for that as soon as possible. And then our final session is about community services to prevent admission to hospital. So they're coming up throughout September. And so do feel free to sign up for those. You'll receive an evaluation after today's session. And as I said earlier, you can request to join the peer-to-peer learning sets. There'll be a limited number of places, and that's where local systems can come together. 6 local systems can come together, and will facilitate 4 sessions with you to really think about how you're working with your dynamic support register and your care education treatment reviews. and so that you can learn from each other, but also hopefully push forward some of that improvement work you're doing in your local systems. Final thank you to all of our speakers today. You've all been fantastic, and hopefully it's been a really useful session for people. And so we will leave you with 25 minutes back to hopefully be able to go and grab a cup of tea before your next meetings. Thank you ever so much, everybody, and we hope to see you at our next couple of webinars.